Good evening, folks. Thank you so much for joining this evening. Maybe you just finished a great meal. I myself made some homemade pizza just in time to eat it before we jumped on here to bring you yet another Carleton event for you folks to join and learn more about Carleton University and some of our programs. My name is Celine Chartrand. I'm a recruitment officer here at Carleton University, and I'm also a very, very proud alumni from our Faculty of Science. So I'm very excited to be able to host this event tonight, which is dedicated really to our science prospective students. And tonight we are bringing you an amazing lecture, a mini lecture called Cannabis and Mental Health, What Have We Learned? So we have some amazing award-winning faculty joining us tonight to give you this lecture. But before we begin, I just want to go over some housekeeping stuff. So on your screen, you'll actually see a Q&A chat that you're able to jump on and ask any of your questions through there. We have an amazing team on our back end as well, from admissions, from neuroscience. They can actually answer any of your burning questions. So please use that chat function to communicate with us. And at the end of the mini lecture, we'll also be doing a live Q&A session. So we'll be able to pull some of those awesome questions you've asked, and we'll ask them live to our faculty members who are lecturing today, and they'll answer them in real time. Okay, so whether it was, that you're interested in neuroscience joining us tonight, maybe the Faculty of Science, or maybe you just read that title and thought, what a cool topic, I want to learn more about it. We welcome everyone wherever you're tuning in from, and we hope you really enjoy tonight. So with that, I'd like to introduce our professors and instructors who are joining us this evening from the neuroscience department. First of all, we have Dr. Zachary Patterson. He actually completed his own PhD at Carleton not too long ago, and then continued on to work at the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse and Addiction. He returned back to Carleton in 2018, and he is now an instructor here at Carleton. He teaches a few courses, and one including a first-year course that you actually might be able to take as a first-year neuroscience student next year, called Neuroscience of Mental Health and Neurological Disease. Joining him today for the lecture is Dr. Kim Hellemans. She is the departmental chair of neuroscience, and she is truly an icon in the neuroscience department here at Carleton. She has won many awards for creating really great communities and passion for teaching her students throughout their undergrad degree. She also teaches quite a few courses, but one again including a first-year course called Neuroscience of Mental Health and Psychiatric Disease. And the last thing I have to mention about Kim Hellemans is an awesome podcast that she co-hosts with one of our professors in the cognitive science department here at Carleton, Jim Davies. So they actually co-host this awesome podcast together called Minding the Brain, and you can check that out on any of your podcast platforms, and it's a good way to get to know neuroscience, psychology, cognitive science a little bit more. And finally, we have Dr. John Stead as well. He's joining us on the back end to answer all of your burning questions about neuroscience. He is the undergraduate chair for the neuroscience department here at Carleton, and he specifically studies, genetics and genomics, including topics like diabetes, stress-related diseases, and even depression. So without further ado, I'd love to pass on the mic and the spotlight over to Zach to do a quick introduction. Then you'll see Kim quickly, and then we'll get right into the lecture.
Thank you very much, Celine, for the nice introduction. And actually, I just want to say thank you to Celine and Emily and Carly and Jalil and Melanie and the whole team really that put this event on and pulled it together. So we're very grateful and thankful for your support. I'm very excited to be here, so welcome everyone. Before I jump in, maybe I'll just throw it over to Dr. Hellemans so we can see her face. She can say a quick hi, and then we'll get right into the content.
Hi, everybody. Super great to be here as well. Cannot underscore how excited I am to have a conversation with you all about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is on a subject that both Zach and I do a lot of research on, which is cannabis and mental health. But I'm also excited to potentially answer your questions on anything to do with science, neuroscience, Carleton University. We're really here to engage you, and looking forward to chatting with you very soon.
All right, so let's get right into it. Cannabis and mental health, what have we learned? So one of the things I hope you take away from this mini lecture is just how complicated, this topic is, right? A lot of times, just because I work in this space, I work in this field, so a lot of times I'll get asked like, hey, Zach, what does cannabis actually do to the brain? And I hope that you find out tonight that that is actually a very complicated question to ask and answer because of all of these, interesting things that are specific to cannabis that are not really specific to any other drug. So let's get right into it. The first, this is just an overview. Yes, sorry, I forgot. So I'm going to introduce kind of what cannabis is. I'll talk about a little bit about who's using cannabis and how cannabis acts on the brain. So again, this is supposed to be like a mock lecture, right? This is giving you a sneak peek into what it would look like to sit in on one of our lectures and learn about stuff. But that's very cool, but that also means that I'm going to zoom in and talk about the brain in a little bit of detail. So we'll actually talk about a neuron and how neurons communicate, and then how cannabis can get in there and change how that information flows. We'll then take a big kind of step out and we'll talk more broadly about how cannabis produces psychological changes, and then of course some of the harms associated with cannabis use. And I think actually Dr. Hellemans will give you a kind of a sneak peek into some of the work we're doing now, which is actually looking at how COVID-19 has influenced everything that we're going to talk to you about tonight. So this is very exciting stuff. Okay, we'll go one slide in advance, please, and thank you. So what is cannabis? Again, that might seem like a very simple and innocent question, but as you'll see in a second, there's so many variables at play here that makes this question a little bit more difficult than you might imagine. So first of all, there's 3 varieties to the cannabis plant. We have Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and then Cannabis ruderalis. And some of you might have heard of Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica before. Cannabis ruderalis is largely ignored. It doesn't produce any intoxicating effects. It's not really harvested. You'll never find this stuff, for sale on the Ontario cannabis site or anything, but it is there. It does exist. We'll focus our discussion today on the first 2 varieties of the cannabis plant, indica and sativa. And so immediately there's like a variable there, right? When we're talking about what is cannabis, we now actually have to specify, are we talking about cannabis sativa or are we talking about cannabis indica? And as it turns out, there are thousands of different kinds of cannabis sativa and thousands of different kinds of cannabis indica. And now there are hundreds of thousands of hybrid strains where we take a sativa and an indica and we would like crossbreed these to create a new hybrid variety of the cannabis plant. So many different variations. And this is very unique to cannabis. We don't really see this with other drugs like alcohol or tobacco or something like this, right? This is kind of unique to working with cannabis. And so each one of these plants, each one of these hundreds of thousands of different plants has about 400 compounds that we've identified, of which at least 70 are psychoactive. So psychoactive is just a very fancy way of saying this acts on the brain, right? Psycho meaning psyche or the brain, and active meaning like it acts on. So these 70 psychoactive components get into your body, they find their way to the brain, and they start doing things, right? So that's a lot of variables to consider when asking this question, what is cannabis? What does cannabis do? So I'm not going to take you through all of the compounds that we have isolated from the cannabis plant. We don't have time for that. So we're going to pick on, we're really going to pick on one, but I'm going to introduce the 3 most common. So of course we have delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol or THC. I think that's probably like the poster child of cannabis. Most people have heard of THC. It is the most common ingredient in the cannabis plant. It was also the first identified. So we've had like much more time to study THC relative to some of the other compounds. And it is the intoxicating compound of the cannabis plant. Okay, so you take THC, you do get intoxicated, you do get that feeling of being high. And we're probably going to spend most of our time talking about THC tonight when we like carry on with this conversation of like, what does cannabis actually do to the brain? But there are 2 other very relevant constituents of the cannabis plant, and that is cannabinol and cannabidiol, or CBN and CBD respectively. I would say CBD has garnered a lot of attention in the last 10, maybe even 20 years. CBN still is largely ignored. Not many people are talking about it. I actually was perusing through the Ontario Cannabis site right before coming to this talk, and like, so if you go to these sites, right, you'll have a menu of all these cannabis products, and these menus will tell you how much THC and how much CBD are in these products, but still very few, if any, are telling you how much CBN is in there, which I think that will probably change. You'll probably learn more about CBN in the years to come as we learn more about this and continue to kind of increase our knowledge of these constituents. So those are the three main ingredients in the cannabis plant. We have THC, CBD, and CBN. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I love talking about this. Who is using cannabis? As it turns out, it's all of you. It's all of you folks that are using cannabis. And I actually don't know. I can't see any of you, so perhaps it's not all of you, but it's mostly our students. It is our youth, our young adult populations that are predominantly using cannabis. And I will add two qualifying statements before I get through the slide. First, all of these statistics are Canadian specific. So it's very possible we have an international audience tonight, and that's fantastic. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy that you could join us. All of these statistics are Canadian specific. The other qualifying statement, and I think this is really important, is that these data are actually pre-legalization. So these data were collected in 2017, right before Canada legalized this substance. And so we actually think that these numbers are actually a little bit lower than they normally would be, because at this time, cannabis was a Schedule I controlled substance. You could literally go to jail for having this stuff. And so that really limits the number of people that are willing to like stick their hand up and say like, yeah, absolutely, I use cannabis, right? It was an illegal activity at that time. So I think Dr. Hellemans will touch just a little bit on kind of how these prevalence rates have changed post legalization. So we'll stick a pin in that for now. We'll revisit it a little bit later. So who is using cannabis? It is mostly our youth. If in that 16 to 24-year-old age bracket, you are 2 times more likely to consume cannabis than someone like me, who is obviously outside of. Unfortunately, I'm on like the higher end of that age bracket, but that's who we see using the most cannabis in this country. Students were much more likely to report cannabis use than any other category. So if you were employed, if you were retired, if you were unemployed, right, there was a lot of options that these participants could choose from. But if you ticked off that you were a student, you were much more likely to use cannabis than anyone from those other categories or those other buckets. The average age of cannabis initiation, or of cannabis use initiation, is 18.7 years of age. That to me is really interesting, particularly from like a neuroscience perspective, because we know with absolute certainty that your brain is still very much under development until the age 25-ish. And so what that means is your brain is still under construction. You're still kind of finishing off the last minute touches and tweaks and modifications of the brain are definitely occurring into the kind of mid-20s. So when someone is initiating cannabis use at age 18.7 years, there is a risk there where cannabis can actually alter the course of neurodevelopment. And I'm sort of choosing my words very wisely here. I'm kind of intentionally being vague because we don't really know the full extent of what cannabis is doing to the developing brain. I can say very confidently that it changes neurodevelopment, but is that for good? Is that for bad? Is that kind of irrelevant? Like all of those kind of details are still up in the air, up for debate. So average age of initiation, 18.7 years of age. And of those individuals who reported cannabis use, 18% of them used cannabis daily, which means about 1 in 5 individuals who are sticking their hand up and saying, yes, like I use cannabis, 1 in 5 of those people use every single day, which would be considered chronic use. And again, once I pass it over to Dr. Hellemans, she'll kind of explain like how chronic and continuous cannabis use might actually set you up for some risk of psychological harm, for example. I want to draw your attention to that graph in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. I love this graph. I think it tells so much. what we're seeing here is the perception of harms related to cannabis on the y-axis, so going straight up and down, and then the rate of use on the x-axis. And what you can see here is a really beautiful relationship between the perception of harm and the rate of use. In other words, if you perceive cannabis to be harmless and nothing bad's going to happen, there's no risk associated with cannabis use, then it predicts that your rate of use goes way up. And that's exactly what we see. On the other hand, if you perceive cannabis to be very harmful, like this is, the devil, this drug is so bad, it should be illegal, all of these things, if your perception of harms is very high, then your rate of use is very low. And there's a really, really strong relationship between perception of harm and rates of use. And why I think this is so important and why I think this is so interesting is because we live in this country where we kind of give mixed signals about cannabis, haven't we? Especially over the last 5 years. Like, it was illegal, now it's legal. We've had the medical marijuana branch of our healthcare system for many, many years. So you have some people getting cannabis prescriptions, other people telling you it's very bad for you, and it kind of messes up how people perceive harms of cannabis. And now we know that this directly predicts rates of use. So I'll just leave that with you to kind of think about, but I think that's really interesting. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, well, we can actually skip this. So how does cannabis affect the body and behavior? So we will actually start this conversation with a little bit on how are you getting this drug into your body? So we call this administration, right? Cannabis administration. We did a study a couple years ago. This was before my time at Carleton, where we were actually looking at Ontario post-secondary education students. So this should hit really close to home. Like, if you come to Carleton, if you join our program, you are in this population. You are a post-secondary education student in Ontario. And we pulled thousands of these students. And as it turns out, from this study, we found out that most people are consuming cannabis either via rolling a joint or a marijuana cigarette, if you will, or taking a bong hit. Okay, so both of those are considered like smoking. You're inhaling that drug. So the number one route of administration of cannabis is inhalation. And inhalation comes with some risks, some inherent risks. And these risks are more associated with like the route of administration as opposed to the risks associated with like cannabis or THC. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. Well, first, if you inhale a drug, it reaches the brain very, very quickly. Okay, so within about 30 seconds, that drug has been absorbed into the bloodstream. It made its way up to the brain and it's starting to do things. So you can feel like the effects of cannabis within actually probably even less than 30 seconds after inhalation. Peak levels happen, somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes. But of course, you now know why that's such a large range, because there's so many variabilities. It really depends on what cannabis plant you're smoking, who you are, all these, other variables. And the intoxicating effects can last about 3 to 4 hours. What is neat about cannabis is that, well, and I'm actually talking specifically about THC here, is THC is very lipophilic, which is a very fancy way of saying fat loving. And so cannabis gets distributed all over the body, and particularly in the very fatty parts of your body, right? So THC will sequester itself into all these little cracks and crevices in your fat depots. By the way, your brain is very fatty too, so it can get in there quite easily. But my point is, cannabis and particularly THC is distributed all over the body very, very rapidly when we're talking about inhalation. And one thing I want to say about inhalation is if you light something on fire and then like breathe in all the fumes, it's not good for you. It's bad for you. And that shouldn't come to a shock, right? That shouldn't come as a shock to you. Like, that makes a lot of sense to me. If you light something on fire and breathe in those fumes, it's really bad for you. And so a lot of the negative health outcomes associated with cannabis, we kind of need to start teasing these things apart. Is it because of the route of administration, or is it because of THC specifically, right? So we need to like do a really good job at studying these things very specifically so that we can actually make more specific like recommendations, like how to use this stuff very safely, right? Lighting things on fire and inhaling them, not good, right? We know this about tobacco smoke, and it's kind of the same way, right? And it's not nicotine that's bad for you. nicotine might actually be good for you in some contexts, but smoking the tobacco plant is very, very bad for you, right? Anyways, this is not electron nicotine, so I'll stop talking about that. Other ways to get cannabis into the body, you can consume this stuff orally. So you can take you can eat a brownie or a weed cookie, for example. This is a much slower and more gradual release of THC. So it takes a while for that. If you eat a weed brownie or something like that, it takes a while for it to get digested in the GI tract. That drug needs to get absorbed into the bloodstream. It needs to travel to the lungs where it picks up some oxygen, then it goes to the heart, and then it gets pumped up into the brain. So there's a bit of a time lag here between when you took the drug and when you start feeling the effects of this drug. And that, by the way, poses some risk associated with oral consumption of cannabis. You might have actually realized this when Canada legalized cannabis, they did not legalize edibles right out of the gate. Of course, now they're on the market, but right out of the gate they didn't, and the reason was because it was quite dangerous. People were consuming cannabis orally. An hour would go by, they didn't feel any of the effects, and they would say, oh, something's wrong, I didn't take enough. So they would take 3 more brownies, and then 2 hours later you're in big trouble, right? You got to go like to the emergency department because you're having a very aversive reaction. So because of that time delay, it actually posed a lot of risk. So that's one big difference between inhalation and oral administration. The other and much less common routes of administration for cannabis are sublingual. So you can buy like these little tinctures that you put under your tongue, and that drug will be absorbed through the mucous membranes in your mouth. And then, of course, there's transdermal administration, which means across the skin. Transdermal translates to across the skin. And so this is much more common on the medical marijuana side. You might have like muscle and joint pain, like inflammatory muscle and joint pain, for which they would prescribe you like a cannabis product that comes in a cream, and you could rub this stuff on your joint, and some of that drug would be absorbed to the bloodstream and kind of, do its thing. So many ways to get this stuff in your body, but inhalation is by far the most common. So if we could advance one more slide, please. So the psychological effects of cannabis are vast. And again, like if you start thinking about all of these variables that I've introduced, right? The different cannabis strains, the different cannabis plants, the hybrids, like all of these individual strains of the cannabis plant will come with it unique properties. So these psychological effects are just kind of on average or generally what we see, but of course they can vary quite a bit. So there's functional effects, and those can be kind of broken up into 3 different categories. We have cognitive effects. So we know that cannabis will decrease attention, it'll decrease concentration, right? Your ability to like ignore everything in your environment and focus on one particular thing. We know your ability to focus and concentrate is impaired while you're under the influence of cannabis. It does impair short-term memory. I'm going to talk in a couple slides about like where exactly cannabis is acting in the brain. And as it turns out, it's doing a lot of its work on these areas in the cerebral cortex and in the hippocampus that we know are associated with cognition, learning, and memory. Behavioral effects, so decreased movement and increased talkativeness, right? So those are very common, functional effects of cannabis. And then the last bucket would be perceptual effects. I actually think a lot of people are using cannabis for the perceptual effects. So this drug changes the way that you perceive your environment, the way that you see colors or taste food or hear a melody in your favorite song or something like that. Your ability to perceive your environment is under the influence of cannabis. And again, that could be like a good thing, that could be a bad thing, but a lot of people are using cannabis for the perceptual changes. For example, if you're an artist and you're, I don't know, I'm not an artist, so it's hard for me to relate to these, but maybe you're like writing a song or something, and if you're under the influence of cannabis, it actually changes the way you think about melodies and rhythm and all of that stuff. And then subjectively, if we ask people like, what are you feeling right now? Like, how does this drug make you feel? It's usually like, I feel very high or I feel intoxicated, and there's a euphoric rush associated with that as well. And I want to loop back to the very first point there. It says in brackets, it may impair performance of driving. So this is a really a fun point of conversation too. Some colleagues of mine did a study 3 years ago, I think. anyways, time flies, but 3 years ago, where they traveled to every province and territory in the country, and they would actually engaged youth, and they were like, hey, what do you guys think about cannabis? Like, what do you know? What do you not know? What do you want to know? What are some myths that you've heard? And we sort of engaged these youth in a conversation. And one thing that really jumped out at me from that study was youth thought that cannabis made them a better driver, which was alarming, because all of the data in the world would suggest to the contrary, that cannabis makes you a worse driver. It decreases reaction time, it impairs decision making, all of these things. We know, and this is not Canadian specific, all of the data in the world would suggest that cannabis makes you a worse driver. But when we talk to youth, they said like, no, actually, I think it makes us better drivers. And we would push them and say like, why? What about this drug makes you a better driver? And they would say like, well, you know, when I'm under the influence of cannabis, I don't speed. Like, I'm really nervous. So I might drive like 78 kilometers an hour in an 80 zone, and therefore it's safer, right? So anyways, I thought that was interesting. We know with absolute certainty that cannabis does impair driving, impair your ability to drive. And so it's probably a good thing that you can't drive under the influence of cannabis in this country. So we can advance the next slide, please. How does cannabis produce these psychological changes? So at this point in the talk, and I'm almost done here, I will hand it over to Dr. Hellemans shortly, but we're actually going to kind of zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to have to introduce a neuron. So if we advance one more slide, there is our lovely neuron. And forgive me, I don't know who's in the audience, so I don't know what you know. This might be very familiar to you, and you might have never heard of a neuron before. So I'm going to try to pitch it somewhere in the middle, but please, you know, use the Q&A box if you want me to elaborate on anything. I'm happy to. So this is a neuron. It's your typical brain cell. These brain cells are, you know, in a lot of ways, they're just like any other cell in your body. It has a nucleus, it has some DNA, it has a ribosome and some mitochondria and all these great parts of a cell. But these neurons have some very specialized parts that makes them very different from most of the other cells in your body. So if you're looking at this diagram, you'll see like the soma. The word soma is Latin for body. So the soma refers to that kind of like the big body part of that cell. And it has an axon. And this axon allows it to kind of send information to across very large distances. So while these cells are like microscopic, like you need a very, very powerful microscope just to be able to see one of these things, these axons can extend several feet, right? They can be very, very long in some cases. And what makes these neurons very special is they kind of speak two languages. Okay, so a neuron will speak with electrical impulses, electrical communication, but they'll also speak using chemicals. So it's kind of like these neurons use two different languages. One is electrical impulses and the other is chemicals, okay? And so that soma, the body of the neuron, will generate this electrical impulse and it sends it all the way down that axon. That could be several inches, it could be several feet. Like these cells get really, really large. And this electrical impulse travels all the way down the axon until it reaches the axon terminals. And at that point, the signal changes. It changes from an electrical signal to a chemical signal. And so this cell will actually release chemicals to communicate with another neuron. So if I'm neuron A, if any of my students were watching, they'd be like rolling their eyes at me right now. But if I'm neuron A and you're neuron B and I'm trying to talk to you, I will generate an electrical impulse, right? That'll travel all the way down my axon. And then I'm going to release some chemicals. And those chemicals will be what you kind of pick up, interpret, and then my message is sent, and so on and so forth. And so if we go to the next slide, I've actually included a little a cartoon where you can kind of see two neurons connected, okay? So neuron A, me, would be like that top cell, top neuron, and neuron B, you, would be like that bottom cell. And if you look at where, like kind of that magnifying glass where we've blown things up a little bit, you can see that like these neurons never actually touch. They come really, really close, but they never physically touch. There's always this space in between them. We call this the chemical synapse. And so if neuron A is trying to send a message to neuron B, it has to release chemicals. And these chemicals are called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters kind of meander their way across the chemical synapse and bind to things called receptors. Now, if you're neuron B, you have these receptors. So when I release my chemicals into the chemical synapse, you will be able to pick up those chemicals, interpret my message, and then do whatever you need to do, you know, with that message. And so This is a really special diagram because every single drug that you know and love acts at the synapse. Of course, there's exceptions to that rule, but generally all of the drugs that that we know and love act on that chemical synapse. They change how neuron A communicates to neuron B. So it does, and so THC is no different in this regard. This is where cannabis is primarily doing its work, is at the level of that chemical synapse. And it doesn't matter if you're taking ibuprofen or like an SSRI antidepressant or something like this. All of these drugs just change how neuron A communicates to neuron B by acting at the level of the synapse. And what we're going to see on the next slide is that when THC is in your system, it actually prevents neuron A from releasing neurotransmitters. Okay, we say that cannabis has very powerful inhibitory effects on neurotransmission. That's a very, very fancy way of saying if THC is in my system, it stops me from releasing those chemical transmitters, which means that if I'm neuron A and I'm trying desperately to talk to you, right, you're neuron B, well, I can't release chemicals. And so our communication is hindered. We can no longer speak. Now, think about what that means like functionally. I mean, maybe we're like driving down the road together and I'm your eyes and I'm saying like, oh, there's an animal in the middle of the road, like we better stop really quickly. So I'm like trying to send that message to you, but if THC is on board, those chemicals aren't released and that message is never really delivered. And so if you are responsible for like, I don't know, hitting the brake pedal or something, you can see while that becomes problematic, right? We're no longer communicating with any real efficiency. So let's put a couple specifics on here, and then I think this is my second last slide, and then I'll toss it over to Dr. Hellemans. So there are two receptors in the brain and the body that respond to cannabis. Okay, they're called the CB1 and the CB2 receptor. CB stands for cannabinoids. So these are the cannabinoid 1 and the cannabinoid 2 receptors. And you might be thinking like, why on earth does my brain have these two receptors that respond to THC, and THC grows in a plant like outside? And the answer to that question is your body doesn't have these receptors that respond to THC that grows outside. Your body has receptors that respond to naturally occurring chemicals in your body. So you and I and everybody else in this room produces things called endocannabinoids. Endo means endogenous, means within. Cannabinoids means like binds to the cannabinoid receptor. So these endocannabinoids are naturally occurring chemicals that we produce very regularly, is very normal, and will bind to those CB1 and CB2 receptors and stop neurotransmitters from being released. Like there is a time and a place where we want this to happen. The problem is when you're consuming cannabis, all this THC is flooding the system from the outside world and like tricking your body into thinking like, oh, we shouldn't release neurotransmitters here because you've stimulated those CB1 and CB2 receptors. So that's essentially how cannabis is working. These endocannabinoids are called anandamide and 2-arachidinyl glycerol. You don't need to know that. I do like teaching about arachidinyl glycerol because, well, if you ever come to Carleton and you run into a Wi-Fi network that is called 2AG, you may or may not know the password for that Wi-Fi network. But anyways, okay, so anandamide and 2AG. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about is where cannabis is acting. We've kind of talked about what it does, but let's talk about where cannabis is acting. So if you could go forward to my last slide. Cannabinoid action on the brain. So this, again, this kind of goes back to my very original point of this is really complicated, right? One of the reasons why the effects of cannabis on the brain and body is so complicated is because if you look at where those CB1 and CB2 receptors are expressed, they're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. In fact, the CB1 receptor is the third most commonly expressed receptor in your brain. It is everywhere. So it's not like, oh, cannabis is just tweaking activity in one little spot of your brain. No. It's actually affecting activity of the entire brain and a lot of your peripheral organs. So on the left-hand panel here, you can kind of see the distribution of the CB1 and CB2 receptors. The CB1 receptors are primarily located in the brain and the spinal cord. And the CB2 receptors are primarily located in the periphery, so in your gastrointestinal tract and certainly in tissues of the immune system. But we find both in both areas. In other words, CB1 receptors are in the brain and the periphery, and CB2 receptors are both in the periphery and in the brain. If we look at the panel on the right, I'm not going to go through this entire diagram in detail, but it's like the effects of cannabis are absolutely related to where those CB1 receptors are expressed in the brain. So we see a huge population of them in this area called the basal ganglia, for example, and the basal ganglia controls movement. And so if you start interfering with the ability of two neurons to communicate in the brain region responsible for movement, then of course you're going to have impairments in movement and reaction time and all these things. We see a very large population of CB1 receptors in the cerebral cortex and in the hippocampus. Both of these areas are responsible for sort of cognitive processing and learning and memory. So again, if you consume cannabis and THC gets in there and prevents these neurons from communicating with each other, then of course we could expect to see effects on cognition and learning and memory, right? So with that, I think I will mute myself and I will pass it over to Dr. Hellemans to tell us a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson. I just want to say how awesome it's been to hear you talk about something. It's always neat to see somebody else teaching about cannabis. And the Q&A session is popping. So lots of great questions that are happening. So for those of you that are listening, don't hesitate to ask questions because John and myself and now Zach will be answering some of the questions that are coming from our live participants. So I'm going to take over. And so Zach's done a great job of kind of introducing how cannabis works in the brain and what are the impacts on certain brain regions. And I'm going to take over and really look at the harms associated with cannabis use. And I'm sure some of you have heard of some of the benefits, right? We hear a lot about the medical benefits of cannabis, right? This has been something that's been touted for many years, not just since legalization. But it's important to have a balanced approach and to recognize that not only does cannabis have medicinal properties, but it also has some harms associated with it, like most drugs, right? So any drug that a human will take, be them prescription medicines or otherwise, will have an impact on the well-being of the individual and not only the brain, but the body, and particularly drugs that are psychoactive, that affect our neurons. They also are accompanied by harms to the nervous system. So bear in mind what I'm going to be focusing in here are the harms that are associated with chronic use, right? So occasional or recreational use is what we say in the addiction world. This is not really what we're talking about. We're talking about harms that are associated with chronic use. So the people that are using daily, near daily, even weekly. Again, the literature isn't really clear on what exactly that means, but we're going to be talking about the harms associated with chronic use. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. So what I'm presenting here is some fairly recent data that was done prior to legalization that sort of shows a snapshot of all the more commonly used substances in Canada and what are the harms that are associated with them. And when you're thinking about harms, you might be thinking only like harms to like medically, but it's important to recognize that there are other harms, right? So you can see on the here on the slide, it's not only harms associated with the healthcare, right? So when and you can look here like alcohol and tobacco are the two substances that have the most harms associated with them, and in particular with the healthcare system, because we know that there are serious and chronic impacts of using alcohol, such as liver disease, cirrhosis, etc., and then of course cancers with both alcohol and tobacco. But there's also harms associated with low productivity. So when somebody is using substances regularly, and we might say that they're even in a state that we might call addiction, there are certainly the harms associated with their inability to not be productive in the workplace or in society in general. And then the last one that I want to focus on is the criminal justice system. So when we think about you know, certain legal and illegal substances that are addictive. You know, certainly when we think about things like cocaine and heroin, which are illegal substances, there are costs to the criminal justice system, right? If somebody is charged with a crime of selling a substance or perhaps even using the substance, they can get fined, they can be thrown in jail, and so on. So again, it's important to just take a look and see that cannabis, relative to other commonly used substances in Canada, have relatively little harms associated with it, and most of the harms are associated with the criminal justice system. And now, post legalization, this is probably going to be less of an issue and concern, right? So that is one of the good things about legalization, and I'll talk more about the benefits of legalization later. But I just wanted to show to everybody, yes, cannabis has harms. It still has less harms relative to other commonly used substances, but also bear in mind that this is also pre-legalization, so we may not yet see some of the indirect costs and harms to society as a result of legalization. Next slide, please. So once again, I'm going to show you some evidence looking, or data really, that's a snapshot of folks that have been surveyed in Canada that are using substances, right? And in particular, this is cannabis. And the data on the left, the slide on the left is pre-legalization, and the slide on the right is post-legalization. And as Dr. Patterson mentioned at the beginning of the talk, why we're here talking to you all and why we study this in our university populations is because the heaviest users of cannabis products, as you can see, this is the top blue line here, across 3 years of study, is youth, right? So youth are the ones that are proportionally using at a higher amount relative to other age groups. And once again, if you look at the graph on the right, you can see again the top line, the age category that is using the most is a youth. And crucially, they're not really using that much more post-legalization. So this was some of the concerns pre-legalization. Oh, you're going to have this sort of widespread use. And there is some evidence to say that, yes, we've seen small blips and small increases in certain age categories, incidentally also among older adults, but it's not been this kind of alarming rapid increase in use as some folks did predict. But again, I want to highlight that we need to be talking about harms, particularly in the context of youth, because those are the individuals that are more likely to be using. Next slide, please. So what is one of the harms? Well, one of the harms, certainly, and is the focus of this talk, is the relationship between cannabis and mental health. So once again, in a proportion of the population that are using cannabis regularly, and we can consider this daily or near daily use, we do tend to see a relationship between cannabis use in adolescence and depression and suicidality in adulthood. So what that means is that across a huge number of scientific studies, we had somebody asking questions about what is the truth in the chat, which is great to see, because we can talk about science and how scientific studies are the ones that are well designed. We do a lot, rigorous studies that are peer evaluated. But this data that I'm talking about right now comes from something called a meta-analysis, where you're taking research from lots of different investigations and combining it together and trying to get a bigger picture of what exactly is the relationship between cannabis use and depression. And again, we see systematically that there is this relationship between cannabis use and adolescence. Again, this is daily, near daily use. So high amounts of regular use of cannabis and increased likelihood of developing depression, and most worrisome, high levels of suicidality in adulthood. And I do want to mention, we are a Department of Neuroscience, so we study the relationship between mental health, and we also try to look at brain changes. And there is a lot of evidence showing really cool studies where they've done neuroimaging. So they've taken folks across different age categories and sometimes followed people across time and looked at how their brain changes with repeated cannabis use. And Dr. Patterson talked about those CB1 receptors that bind THC, that also bind anandamide, and we see lots of brain changes in those regions that bind to CB1 with folks that are using cannabis at high rates across adolescence and into adulthood. There's also a mild to moderate relationship, mildish relationship with anxiety. So some of you that might be using cannabis products, you may be using because you find it actually makes your anxiety go away. Like some people use cannabis to try to relieve their anxiety symptoms, and that, surprise, surprise, alcohol does the same thing, right? Alcohol is also used as what's called a social lubricant. It tends to relieve social anxiety, as does cannabis. But there's some evidence that using cannabis in folks that already have anxiety can actually worsen anxiety over time. And this is something that myself and our research group has been trying to explore more systematically. Next slide, please. So here you can see this is data taken from Australian research looking at how often people are saying that they're experiencing psychological distress, both among cannabis users and non-users. And they've separated into folks that are either experiencing high amounts of psychological distress or very high amounts. And what you can see here from the dark blue bar is that folks that are using cannabis in the last 12 months experience higher levels of psychological distress than those that are not using cannabis. And it's important here to point out that correlation does not equal causality. We cannot assume from this graph, and here's something that we teach you guys if you're interested in having a degree in science, we teach you a lot about critical thinking, right? We teach you about how to interpret these figures and how to make sense of that data. And what that data is telling you is there's a relationship. People who are using cannabis tend to have more symptoms of psychological distress, but it's not telling you that cannabis can cause psychological distress. Next slide, please. So the question is, can cannabis actually cause depression? Does using cannabis lead to depression? And the answer is very complex. As Dr. Patterson introduces at the beginning of this talk, the challenge with cannabis is there's so much complexity and so much that we really don't know. And because we've only really started to do a lot of research systematically post-legalization, there's a gold mine of research to uncover this. But emerging evidence suggests maybe it does cause depression. So what some scientists have done are what are called longitudinal studies. So they take a population of people at a specific period in time, and they do a whole series of questionnaires. And they, as neuroscientists, we might also take blood, we might take saliva, we might do a brain scan, we might look at other biomarkers of interest. And then we follow these people across time. And then we follow up with them at that time period and rerun all those analyses. And what the data show is that folks that were using cannabis at time point A were more likely to have depressive symptoms at follow-up, but being depressed at time point A didn't predict a cannabis use disorder or cannabis addiction. So it does suggest that the relationship seems to favor cannabis promoting depression. But there are complexities with that probably relate to genetics, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So one of the other things that we know in terms of the harms associated with cannabis, and this is probably what most of you have already heard of, because now we're starting to have a lot more education and awareness campaigns about this, particularly among youth, is the relationship between cannabis use and psychosis. We have known for just about 2,000 years, believe it or not, that cannabis use can produce symptoms of psychosis. So pictured here on the slide on the left is actually an excerpt from the world's oldest known pharmacopoeia, which is essentially a book that describes the pharmaceutical properties of plants. And that's the Pensao Ching, which was published in about 200 BCE, or before Common Era. And as you can see in the slide here, it says, eat more. This is a translation from Cantonese, and you will see white ghosts walking around, and eat long enough and you will know how to talk to them. So, you know, if any of you have used cannabis, you might feel like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? So they've known this for a long time, right? So psychosis, just to be very clear, is a symptom of some psychiatric disorders, including things like schizophrenia. But it's kind of like that, the separation between your thoughts and reality, right? So you can get psychosis from a number of symptoms or diseases such as manic depressive disorder or even drug-induced psychosis. But it seems to be that cannabis use can produce psychosis. And again, in more evidence of this comes from Marie de Tour, who was a French psychiatrist in the early parts of the 19th century, who had a club de hachachine, and he was a psychiatrist who was giving hash, which is a form of a cannabis product, very potent, to his patients, and discovered that, lo and behold, it actually produced these psychotic episodes. And now we're seeing in Canada a huge number of inpatient admissions in Ottawa. Here we're seeing it at CHEO, where we're seeing in particular young men that are using high dose THC, high dose content THC, and having these psychotic breaks. So this is something that is concerning, of course, from a healthcare perspective. I was trying to understand that relationship and that risk. Next slide, please. And again, what it appears to be is there are a number of factors that seem to promote risk for psychosis, right? So it's not everybody. I kind of hinted at one of them. It appears to be in men, so it favors gender for males for whatever reason, using high dose cannabis products before the age of 15 in particular, and again, daily or near daily use. And it's likely related to genes. So it's not, there's what's called a gene by environment interaction, where if people have a certain copy of a type of gene that we know involves the regulation of a specific neurotransmitter in the brain, plus they're using a high dose THC cannabis products, that seems to unlock that gene's activity to make it more likely to develop psychosis or schizophrenia-like disorders. So there's a lot that scientists have learned there, and this is definitely something that we need to be messaging out to youth because this is certainly a risk factor. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to discuss is the fact that cannabis is addictive. So I've had a lot of folks kind of look at me, particularly like 5-10 years ago when I started teaching about this topic, that were like, it's not addictive, it's a harmless herb, right? It's a plant. Well, guess what? Most drugs actually come from plants. Cocaine comes from plants. Heroin comes from plants. Alcohol comes from distilled fruits, right? And tobacco, right? Most things come from plants, right? So cannabis is actually, it is addictive. So we know this because the active ingredient, as Dr. Patterson was mentioning earlier, can act in the brain like other addictive substances. And if you take my 4th year addiction class, you will learn this until your brain wants to explode, because I talk all about the specific neural circuits involved in addiction. And we talk about cannabis. If you're using it, it can lead to tolerance. Again, it's in a specific proportion of the population that need to smoke more to get that same high. If you stop smoking, in certain people, they get withdrawal symptoms. So cannabis gives you the munchies. It makes you really talkative. It kind of makes your locomotor activity, you feel sluggish. Withdrawal symptoms, you kind of feel anxious, your stomach is upset. In fact, in chronic cannabis users, we actually see something called hyperemesis syndrome, where smoking too much can actually make you vomit repeatedly. So that's something that ER docs are trained to look for. And then cannabis users can show what's called relapse, which is a phenomenon in addiction, where we say that addiction is a chronic relapsing disorder, where if you're using cannabis or any product regularly and then you try to quit, a relapse is when you start using again. And the most recent statistics, this is recently published in 2020, 1 in 6 cannabis users will go on to develop what's called a cannabis use disorder, which is the diagnostic term for a cannabis addiction. And this is definitely gendered. We see this more often in males relative to females. Next slide, please. So all this might say, you might be going, well, Kim, look at all these harms, right? Why would Canada legalize, right? Well, the reality is decriminalization is a really, really important piece here. We know that the war on drugs doesn't work. We know that when we criminalize folks that are selling and using substances, we also see a huge proportion of the population that are Black, that are Indigenous, from marginalized populations. So we're seeing this repeated recidivism among folks that are already marginalized. So criminalizing them doesn't work, right? We know that. Legalization also means that we have more funding to do research to study this, and then allows us to educate, right? Doing what we're doing today, we're providing awareness about the harms that are associated with use. We are big believers in what's called harm reduction. You're going to use cannabis. Here are the facts, right? Now you have an educated choice and decision as to whether or not you're going to use these substances. Next slide, please. So finally, I just want to say, if you are going to use, there are some red flags, right? So like alcohol, like tobacco, like any substance, there are risk factors, right? So if you have a family history or you yourself have a psychiatric illness, this means that you are more at risk for the development of worsening mental health as a result of chronic cannabis use. Also, if you have a lifetime history of trauma, if you've experienced severe stressful circumstances in your life, again, this is one of the biggest predictive factors for the development of any addiction, not just cannabis addiction. And finally, if you are using and you find that you're using often alone, you're often using to relieve poor mood or feelings of anxiety or sadness, this again suggests that you're self-medicating another mental health disorder that could be worsened with chronic cannabis use. So the last thing I'll say is that we are studying this, next slide please, in the context of COVID. So Dr. Patterson, myself, and other colleagues that also show shortly are actually, I don't think I have the slide, but other faculty members in the Department of Neuroscience, as well as some of our fantastic students, have been studying how cannabis use has been changed in the era of COVID. And because we know that COVID is yet another stressor that university students are facing, so we're trying to understand how has that changed not only their mental health symptoms, but also their coping with cannabis use. So we recently published an article in The Conversation Canada, and pictured here on the slide is a sort of a screenshot of our ongoing study. We've got about 1,000 participants that filled in our questionnaires this fall, and we're hoping to have some data to be published very soon on that topic. So I think the next slide is finally questions. Yep. So at this point, I think I've seen things lighting up in the Q&A. I think we might be able to take some questions live.
Yeah, I'll just turn to Kim. Thank you both so much, Kim and Zach. That was amazing. I think all of our attendees definitely learned something. We definitely learned something on the back end here from our recruitment office. So that was awesome. Thank you so much. I did have a couple of questions written down if you want me to just moderate for you, and you can answer some as we go. And Zach, same for you. We can kind of pull you both in whatever you feel comfortable answering. So there was a question that came in last minute here. So do you think that the relation between cannabis use and depression has more to do with people using it to cope with their problems, or the actual THC or other things within the drug?
So are they using because they're depressed, or so I think what's happening is the THC, because what it does is it actually acts on circuits in the brain that are involved in feeling good. So your reward circuits. When you're using THC, it actually makes you feel better, right? So I think it's both. So the THC is promoting good mood and could be self-medicating that low mood, which is again problematic, especially if you've got the wiring or the neurocircuitry that is leading to the depression, because it's going to mean that your body will potentially stop making your own natural feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters, right? Because it's being punched with so much of that THC that's like, oh, well, I don't need to make any more dopamine and I don't need to make any more endocannabinoids. You're getting it from this external source. So shut down its own production, and which could actually escalate and make the depression and anxiety, if that's the case, worse. Great question.
Yeah, that's great. One more here for Kim, and then we'll throw Zach in the hot seat. But another one came in. What would you recommend to someone who does think that they have developed an addiction to cannabis? What sort of support system should be utilized over the next question mark? Next a little while, I'm assuming they were trying to say. Despite the decriminalization, there is still a stigma that most definitely prevails within the medical community. So how would someone go about seeking help after an already negative response from a medical professional?
Yeah, again, wonderful question, and I agree. I think there's a lot of the work that I do. If you go onto the neuroscience website, you go to my homepage, is around stigma, and I'm very committed to reducing stigma around substance use and addiction, because I think there is a lot of negative attitudes from healthcare professionals around folks that are using substances. And so what I would recommend is if you know somebody who is struggling with a cannabis use disorder or thinks that they may have addiction to cannabis products and they're looking to seek support and treatment, is to actually find somebody on the Canadian Psychological Association, or CPA website. There's lots of fantastic clinical psychologists and healthcare professionals that are really trained to deal with addiction, and you will receive less stigma because those folks are trained more with a psychosocial approach to well-being, and they often have trauma-informed care, which means that they recognize circumstances in individuals' lives that could lead to addiction. So I would seek supports from a psychologist, and there's lots of great professionals out there. So make sure you're looking for somebody that has within their bio that they treat cannabis addictions.
That's great. That's great advice for sure. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to throw Zach in here now. You did answer this in the chat, but just for other folks who maybe didn't see it, I think it's a great question about vaping and cannabis. So specifically, the question came up: is there any difference, even a slight difference, between the traditional way that cannabis was inhaled and the way it's inhaled today through vaping, especially since vaping is skyrocketing in popularity with younger people today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as I mentioned in the Q&A forum, there is kind of like there is differences for sure. So they're not equivalent. At some level, you're inhaling THC and CBD and CBN and all the other constituents in the cannabis plant. So on that level, they're the same. Whether you're smoking out of a bong or you're vaping, you are inhaling those THC particles. But what is very different is that vaping is primarily associated with very highly concentrated THC products, and I'm being specific with my words when I say THC products, because yes, you can vape a blend of THC and CBD and other terpenes and things like this, and it's a sort of a much more balanced substance or compound. But most of the things that are being vaped are the THC distillates, the concentrates, butane hash oil, these things that are very highly concentrated with THC. And as Dr. Hellemans was mentioning earlier, those high THC products are associated with risk. So when we talk about like risk of cannabis use across the board, that's one thing. But when you're talking about an extremely high potency THC product, I think that level of risk is stepped up like substantially, right? And we have these young, typically male adults that are showing up to the emergency departments with very negative experiences associated with cannabis use, and those are almost always associated with very high potency THC products, right? So this is what you're consuming in those vapes. So I don't know if that answers your question. They're the same in that they're both inhalation of that drug, but typically vaping is associated with high potency THC products. The other main difference is now this will I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole of the ratio of these drugs, right? The ratio of THC to CBD matters. It's not just the absolute value of each. And a lot of what we see on the vaping side is pure products, all THC, zero CBD. And again, those products are riskier. They're more associated with harms. I'm not saying they are harmful or you will go to the hospital. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. Just the risk of experiencing harms goes way up when you're talking about a purely a highly concentrated THC product. So you kind of want some CBD in there, and that seems to kind of bring you back down to the normal level of risk that we see with smoking a joint or a bong. By the way, that's not no risk. It's just lower risk than those THC only products.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great answer for sure. And I'm just going to ask more of a personal or opinionated question here. It was asked here, and I think John gave a really good answer, but in your opinion, Zach, do you think that cannabis should be legal or illegal? What is your opinion on that?
Well, I saw that question, and then I saw that Dr. Stead was answering. I got very jealous that John was all over that one. I mean, to me, that's an extremely interesting question. My opinion is that yes, absolutely 100% it should be legalized. Prohibition doesn't work. It hasn't worked for other drugs. It didn't work for cannabis. And like, we know this with absolute certainty. That one of the first slides I presented to you all was like, who is using cannabis? And it was all of you. But remember, that was pre-legalization. That was in an environment where that was a Schedule I controlled substance. You could, but still our youth and a lot of people in this country continued to use the substance. So if the government's goal was to prevent people from using cannabis, prohibition did not work. We know this, right? But there's so many other facets to legalization. One reason they legalized was to generate income, was to generate money. You can do that in a legalized market. You cannot do that in a market of prohibition where organized crime is reaping the benefits, at least economically, right? Another thing that they wanted to accomplish was actually taking a bite out of that black market, that organized crime. And again, in a legalized market, you can do this. You can offer a competitive product. In cannabis prohibition, that was not the case, right? All of the sales went to organized crime, and I think like safety, public safety was another big factor, right? At least if the government is supplying the cannabis, it's standardized, it's reliable. Like, I often make the comparison to the alcohol industry. Can you imagine if you didn't know what you were buying? Like let's say you went and bought a case of beer, for example, but you didn't know how much alcohol was in each of those bottles. How could you ever drink responsibly? What if one of those bottles of beer was full of, I don't know, moonshine, but you couldn't tell the difference by looking at it or smelling it, or you just consumed it and then you figure it out? It's like you could not drink responsibly. So in terms of public safety, legalization makes a lot of sense. At least people know what they're consuming. They have standardized doses. They know, okay, this much is good for me. This is too much for me, right? So in public safety, and then Dr. Hellemans made the point beautifully earlier, is that the law was not being applied equally to everyone. We have really good evidence to show that, white people and black people use cannabis at roughly the same rates. But if you look at those who were, in jail for cannabis-related harms, it's mostly people of color, Indigenous people, people from marginalized communities. The laws were not being applied equally. So, anyways, I could go on for literally an hour about this, but I'll stop there. Yes, I think it should have been legalized. The only issue I have, was about the age, because of the brain development thing. But that's just not the only point of consideration that the government had to make. So I thought, all things considered, they did a really good job. And it's not perfect, and it's still evolving, but I think it was a really good start.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a great opinion to hear for sure. Okay, I do want to just turn gears a little bit here just before we end things off. I'm just mindful of time. I do want to kind of talk a little bit more about quickly the neuroscience department itself at Carleton. So Kim, maybe I'll throw you in here quickly. And I just want to ask, I noticed that you had talked about some cannabis research that's going on. You said you have 6 students that you're supervising. So how can undergrads get involved, and what kind of research are you doing specifically on cannabis, or anything else you want to share about your research?
Sure, thanks for that, Celine. So yeah, we have our department has a reputation of very much being student-focused, student-centered. We have a really good camaraderie with our students, who I miss very much being in a COVID era. We really endeavor to get to know our students very well. When they graduate, I know every single student by name, and that's in part because of the relationships that we build with the students, not only in our classrooms but also in our labs. And so we have lots of opportunities for students to get hands-on experience in our research. So I think John was answering in the chat that We have the Dean Summer Research Internship, which is a really amazing opportunity that students can have in the Faculty of Science at Carleton, where we pay you to work with us in the summer, right? So in our department, we do everything from the neuron to the neighborhood. We have lots of folks that study cellular molecular mechanisms involved in everything related to stress, trauma, and the brain. We have folks that do electrophysiology, so recording action potentials from cells, so little petri dishes with cell populations in there that they're listening to. We have folks that do a lot of genetic manipulation, so trying to understand what is the gene expression following a specific manipulation. We have folks like Dr. Kim Matheson, who studies mental health and stigma among Indigenous populations in northern communities. So we really have the whole breadth of research experience in our department, and students have these opportunities like the Dean Summer Research Internship. We often take on volunteer students to work in our labs, and then we have things like the iCurious, where students can again be paid to work throughout the academic semester. We have the NSERC USRA, which is like a very prestigious award, again, to do research in the summers. And then we also have our third-year labs. So the Department of Neuroscience was the first university in Canada to offer undergraduate teaching labs in neuroscience that we're hoping to roll out as soon as COVID kind of sees the back end of this. But we have teaching labs where students will be coming into third year, slicing brain tissues, slicing brains, looking at them under a microscope, spitting into a cup, measuring the levels of their stress hormone, lots of exciting hands-on activities. The research that I do, along with my colleague Dr. Patterson, Dr. Abizaid, Dr. Robin McQuaid, what we're looking at is the relationship between mental health and substance use, like cannabis in particular, among university student populations, and also how that affects academic outcomes. And my colleague Dr. Robin McQuaid and myself also have been looking at, and Dr. Patterson, how specific genes relate to their cannabis use, right? So we're looking at things like single nucleotide polymorphisms, little changes in the nucleotide expression of genes, where how that makes people more likely to have problematic cannabis use if they also have a life history of trauma. And Robin's also interested in looking at how certain inflammatory factors, so things in the body that relate to inflammation, also relate to mental health symptoms. So a huge breadth, a huge variety, lots of opportunities, a really exciting department, one of the youngest departments on campus, brand new building, brand new teaching facilities, brand new research labs.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think that's a great place to sort of end things off and wrap things up. Just set myself live here. Awesome. So a huge thank you to both Dr. Patterson, Dr. Hellemans, and as well Dr. Stead being on the back end answering some of your questions there. I think that was an extremely informative event to be a part of. Again, getting that little sneak peek into what a neuroscience lecture might look like, as well as even any lecture that you might attend at Carleton when you become a Carleton student. So a huge thank you to the three of you for being here with us today and presenting on that. So with that, that kind of ends off our event here. We do have a really awesome initiative that we're putting on next week for prospective students. It is called CU Info Week, and basically it's starting next week, so December 7th, next Monday. We're basically going to be putting on presentations about how to apply to Carleton, so how that application process works, the important dates and deadlines, and then we're also going to be doing presentations about what can I do with my degree. So your career, your future, they're called, and it'll be a good opportunity to jump on and actually ask those questions and learn what you can do post-graduation after you finish at Carleton for job opportunities. And as well, we are also doing parent evening events. So if there's any parents who are attending this evening right now, we will be having parent directed or targeted presentations next week as well. So with that, folks, sign up on Carleton 360. You can put information about your program of interest, get tailored information about that program. You know, for you folks joining today, maybe that's neuroscience. So jump on there, put neuroscience as your program of interest, and we'll send you more info about that. I hope you enjoyed tonight's evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Cheers, everyone. Have a great night.